In early 2025, the United States passed a law that has sparked intense debate over immigration, public safety, and the balance of federal and state powers. This law is called the Laken Riley Act, named after a young woman whose tragic death became the centerpiece of a national conversation about crime and immigration. Signed into law on January 29, 2025, this act reflects the federal government's new hardline approach to undocumented immigrants accused of crimes, and it is reshaping the legal landscape for law enforcement and state governments alike. The story behind the Laken Riley Act begins with a tragedy that captured the attention of the entire country. Laken Riley was a college student whose life was cut short in a violent crime that authorities allege was committed by an undocumented immigrant. Her death ignited widespread outrage and calls for stronger measures to ensure that individuals who enter the country illegally and commit crimes cannot remain in the United States. Politicians, media outlets, and advocacy groups quickly turned this case into a symbol of the perceived failures of the immigration system. In the weeks that followed, the demand for tougher laws became a rallying point for lawmakers pushing for stricter enforcement. The Laken Riley Act responds to these demands with sweeping new rules. First and foremost, the law mandates that any undocumented immigrant charged with certain crimes must be held in mandatory federal detention without bail. These crimes include burglary, theft, assaulting law enforcement officers, and any act that results in serious physical harm to another person. This marks a major shift from prior policies, where local and state jurisdictions often had the discretion to release individuals on bail while they awaited trial. Now, federal authorities are required to detain these suspects until their cases are resolved or until they are removed from the country. Beyond detention rules, the law introduces a groundbreaking provision that empowers states to take legal action against the federal government. If a state can show that the federal government's failure to detain or deport an undocumented immigrant led to harm, whether that harm is financial, such as the cost of law enforcement and social services, or the tragic loss of human life, the state has the right to sue the federal government for damages. This provision reflects growing frustration among certain states that believe Washington has not done enough to secure the border or enforce immigration laws. By giving states this legal tool, the Laken Riley Act sets the stage for potentially unprecedented lawsuits that could reshape the balance of power between states and the federal government in immigration enforcement. Supporters of the Laken Riley Act argue that it is a necessary step to protect American communities from preventable crimes. They point to high-profile cases like Laken Riley's as evidence that the system is broken. To them, the idea that someone who entered the country illegally could commit a serious crime and remain free while awaiting trial is unacceptable. They believe that mandatory detention sends a strong message to would-be offenders and ensures that no family has to endure a similar tragedy. The law's supporters also highlight the state lawsuit provision as a tool for accountability. By allowing states to recover costs or demand justice when federal inaction leads to harm, they say the law finally gives local communities leverage in a long-running fight over border security and immigration policy. However, the Laken Riley Act is not without its critics. Civil rights organizations, immigrant advocacy groups, and some legal scholars have raised alarms about the law's potential consequences. One major concern is due process. Mandatory detention without the possibility of bail can mean that individuals who are merely accused, but not yet convicted, of crimes could spend months or even years in detention. Critics argue that this undermines the principle of innocent until proven guilty and risks sweeping up people who may ultimately be found not guilty. Another area of concern is the potential strain on federal detention facilities. With thousands of undocumented immigrants facing various charges each year, mandatory detention could overwhelm the system. Detention centers are already facing scrutiny for overcrowding, poor conditions, and high costs to taxpayers. Expanding mandatory detention may worsen these issues unless significant investments are made in infrastructure and staffing. The state lawsuit provision is also highly controversial. Legal experts question whether allowing states to sue the federal government over alleged enforcement failures will survive court challenges. Immigration enforcement is traditionally a federal responsibility, and courts may view these lawsuits as attempts to shift that authority. Furthermore, critics warn that the law could create a patchwork of legal battles that politicize immigration policy even further, with some states aggressively suing the federal government while others refuse to participate. Despite these criticisms, the Laken Riley Act reflects the current political climate in the United States. Immigration has been one of the most polarizing issues for decades, and high-profile crimes involving undocumented immigrants often trigger calls for swift and severe action. By enacting this law, the government has signaled that it is prioritizing public safety and accountability over the concerns of civil liberties groups and immigration advocates. In the coming months and years, the impact of the Laken Riley Act will become clearer. Law enforcement agencies will adjust to the new mandatory detention requirements, courts will weigh in on the legality of state lawsuits, and communities will monitor whether the law actually reduces crime or simply fills detention facilities. Supporters will likely point to any prevented incidents as proof that the law works, while opponents will track cases of prolonged detention and legal battles to highlight its flaws. The Laken Riley Act is more than just another piece of legislation. It is a reflection of a broader shift in American immigration policy toward stricter enforcement and less tolerance for legal ambiguity. For some, it represents justice and protection for victims. For others, it is a troubling step toward criminalizing entire communities and eroding civil rights. One thing is certain: this law, born from a moment of national tragedy, will continue to shape the conversation on immigration and public safety for years to come.